one listing, so get ready to get your prices ready, and then we will go from there. Let me see here. There we go. All right. So let's just jump into our announcements. First, foremost, we always got to thank our sponsors that always provide so much for us. Monarch Title, you got to go thank Frank for always crowding your social media mailbox. InView Media for all our photos and all our stuff for our houses and all that great stuff. OnTrack Escrow, making sure our escrows go smooth as butter. Mortgage Express, Old Republic, NHG Solutions, the Smart Move Academy. Thank you guys for always being in partnership with us. If anyone's not on there. All right, guys, Ignite starts July 7th at 10 a.m. or 4 p.m. The very start date is going to be a session where Drew is going to be kicking it off, telling you about Ignite, what it entails. It is a month-long course of really getting your business ignited or reignited, especially after COVID. If things have been a little slow, you got to reignite that business. So July 7th, 10 a.m., come in, learn about it. If you can't make 10 a.m., then come in at 4 p.m. You definitely want to make sure you Ignite. Even if you can't make the Ignite classes once it starts, we'll be putting them on social media afterwards, and you can still participate. So make sure to do that. Mega Camp August 23rd through 26th. Early bird pricing begins right now. Mega Camp is a digital this year because of everything going on. There is a few people going in person, but you had to be at a certain production level to get that invite. So you could do it online. The cool thing is it is much, much cheaper. Normally it's an $800 ticket, airplane ticket out to Austin and a hotel for a couple days. It's normally a couple $1,000 event. It's great, but now you can do it virtually. I believe the pricing right now is $89. So you could jump in and watch it all virtually from home on the couch with a beer or a orange juice.
Coffee.
Oh, wait, it depends when you watch it, all right? If it's after 12, then the beer's okay. All right, Script Warriors. If you guys have missed Script Warriors, then you've probably missed this. Hold on, let's get it big. Oh, yeah. Yeah, baby. All right. That is what you guys are missing by not coming to script practice every morning at 8 o'clock. JD's been doing the script practice. It is fantastic. Some of you guys have been in here. Every morning they're doing their affirmations. They're jumping into script practice. Then right after script practice, they're going into real play. They're doing calls. Right before this meeting, they were doing calls. I walked in, I could cut the tension with a knife because everyone's getting nervous about to make those calls. And then everything went great. Nothing bad happened to them. They're still alive. And they're sharpening up their skills. So join that class. Make sure to do that. It's lots of fun. Let's see if I missed it. All right. And then happy 4th of July, guys. Today at 4 to 7 at the Waffle Kitchen over on the east side, 4611 East Avenue West, right next to the Keller Williams East Side. We're doing a special fun kick event. We have our, there it is. We have our donations for the kids, for the shoes, for the school that we're trying to impact. So bring a pair of shoes, come over, bring a Cobroke, let them show what our culture is about at Keller Williams. It's going to be a fun event today. There's drinks, but to get a drink, I think you have to bring shoes or a Cobroke. What's the rule with getting a free drink? Shoes or Cobrokes. These shoes are all going to kids of a specific elementary school that are in Palmdale and out the east side. And they have a need for them. A lot of these kids come to school every day and they don't have proper shoes that fit. They're hand-me-downs or sandals and they get sent home. And we want to make sure those kids start off the school year excited with a nice new pair of shoes. It's a really cool event, guys. And so please, please, please come on over and bring your shoes. A lot of people have also been donating money because they can't make the event. If you want to do that, you could stop by with them on and drop off a check and then we'll get the shoes for you if you don't have time. So it's a really cool event. That's today. For the event, the collection date is by July 15th, so you still have some more time if you can't get the shoes today. All right. Oh, missed that one there. Also, guys, Carlos Apayas has been a part of our family for ever. Carlos is always at every event. He's our family. And he had some really bad health issues, and he actually had to get a lung transfer. And thank God, lungs came in and a match came in, and he's had the surgery, and he is doing well. Saying that, a lot of unexpected expenditures came up, and now we're looking to try to raise some money. KW Cares has donated, but he's also trying to raise some money for him to help cover some of those expenses. There has been on Facebook, social media, there's been some stuff that's come out. Also, you guys have received an email. If you're in a position to maybe give a little, that would be great, just to help Carlos cover those needs. That would be really fantastic. Like I said, we try to help the family here, and he's definitely one of our family members, and he's been a part of it. If you don't know Carlos, you will, as he'll be back in hugging everybody like he normally does. All right, Amy, you want to come up here and do a round of Price is Right, and then we'll hand it over to Jeff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. How are you? You ready for the Price is Right? Hi, Jeff. Out in Zoom land, you Zoomers, hello, everyone. So, Price is Right. Who was here last week? Raise your hand virtually or wonderful. Now, last week, what was my request to you?
To bring someone.
To bring someone, right? Thank you. So, who'd you bring? I don't think so. Okay, so here's the deal. I would like for you to exercise the muscle of influence. The muscle of influence. And that is that, do you have to have influence when you're a realtor?
Yes.
Yeah, you do. You have to have influence when you're a realtor. So when I see you sitting alone, I think, what?
You didn't bring anybody.
No influence. And if you can't have influence right here in the office, where can you have it?
Nowhere.
Really nowhere. Because it shows up. It'll show up in your family life. It'll show up everywhere in your life. So I'm here to put the mirror in front of your face. I love doing the Price is Right. I do. But here's the thing. We're supposed to, with that, if you can't say, hey, listen, I challenge you to the Price is Right. Come with me. And by the way, we have an attorney today that happens to be on the forms committee with CAR, who happens to also be our attorney for E&O. If that's not a good reason enough to bring someone, I don't know what is, honestly. So what are we going to do next week?
Bring someone.
Bring someone. Hey, listen, if you bring two, woo! Right? So here we go. All right. So you know the rules. The Price is Right. Cannot go over the price. We're gonna have a property showing up. You have to, it's a closed property in the past 2 weeks. And you'll have to guess what it's sold for without going over. The person who is closest to that will receive a Starbucks card. Ready? Ready?
Ready.
All right, come on, let's do this.
Oh, you want me to click? I'm
I'm afraid
You
to
just,
overclick.
don't overclick.
Yeah, I'm afraid
Okay,
to
don't
overclick.
overclick.
Okay, so here we are. This is a 5-bedroom, 3-bath. Is this east or west
This
side?
is West Side Palmdale.
West Side Palmdale, built 2004, 37 and some change in square feet. Beautiful home. Look at that 3-car garage
On almost
with
that
RV
picture.
Take
access.
one from there.
Look at this.
And a pool.
And
Uh-oh.
a swimming
Pool
pool.
home. Uh-oh.
Oh boy.
How many acres?
0.4.
Is there a guest house there, or is that all one house?
That's 0.4 acres.
One house.
One house.
Almost 4,000 square feet, single story.
Looks like it's got a little pool room there on the side, a little extra. Oh, look at that. Keep going. Let's
Nope,
see.
that's it.
That's
One more click.
it. All right.
So you got to get your pricing in. And Zoom,
Zoom.
Larry's got it in.
Put what you think it is. Write it down if you're in this room. Okay. All my Zoomers. Zoomers, come on. Let's get. All right. You got it. Wrote it down. All right. Let's see. Start shouting it out.
450. 675.
Oh,
40.
650.
I was in
What
709.
is it?
760.
There it is. Ready? Let's see who
7,
did not go over.
I said
797.
760.
What do we got on Zoom?
That's outrageous.
590.
What did you have, JD?
760.
Oh, wow, 760, JD.
JD's a winner.
Go. There you go. Woo! Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
So usually we do about 3 or 4, right? So now, we're not. So you bring a friend, we'll do more. How's that? Is that a deal?
Punish.
All righty, next week, see you next week. All right, without further ado.
Yep.
Without further ado, here you go. Our E&O firm and attorney, Jeff Kahn, take it away.
I'm bringing it up to the front, guys, so you don't have to turn around.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we're going to crank you up a little bit because we're a little quiet on our side, but we're going to crank you up so you'll be all right. You got it?
Okay.
And make them.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, good. So it sounds like you have a combined meeting, some people live and some people on Zoom?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so you're getting back to almost normal stuff in the office?
I think this will be forever normal. I think Zoom and combined will be the new normal.
Yeah, I think so. So I know some of you, but for those of you I don't know, my name is in the 80s. Starting in August through CAR. With that, and we also, Spine Left and Gore does risk management for your office and some of the E&O insurance for your office as well. I'm the risk management guy, and again, been involved in forms for many, many years. So what we're going to cover today, first off, we're going to cover the new and revised forms from CAR that came out a couple weeks ago, and then we're going to do a little update on the residential purchase agreement. I'm going to cover some of the problem areas that agents and brokers seem to be having issues with, and buyers and sellers having issues with, some of the new laws that have come into play, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll probably be spending about an hour and a half together. I'll be happy to answer questions, and I'm not sure who on your end will be checking the chat, but as I go through the forms, as I finish a form, I'll ask someone on your end to check to see if there's anybody that wants to ask a question. So rather than having to wait till the end, you can jump in during the time if you have a question, so you don't have to wait and maybe forget your question. So with that, I'm going to try to screen share now so you can see some of the forms. So let me see if that will work.
And Jeff, the people in the audience here, the room is mic'd, so if they ask questions, you'll be able to hear anybody in the room that has a question.
Okay. And let me see if I can. I'm going to need to, let's see if I can get rid of this. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we see you.
Please do.
And you see that there's two forms up there now. There's switch it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, we see both the forms.
Yeah.
Trying to move them, but I'm having a little trouble with it. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, that should do for now. You should all see on the left side a form that says transfer of listing agreement. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So that's the first form I'm going to cover. That's a new form that came out a couple weeks ago from CAR. This form was designed to be used when a listing is being transferred from one broker to another, one brokerage to another.
Oh, that's cool.
It may be an agent who's leaving an office and coming to your office, but not necessarily. It's just a transfer of listing from one brokerage to another. And there's been a request for this form for quite some time. So if you look at the form, under paragraph 1, it talks about the transfer from the current broker to a new broker. And then in paragraph 2, it has the consideration for doing so. So the principal might be paying the current broker some fee in order to get the cancellation, or item 2B, the new broker might be paying a referral fee to the old broker for the transfer of the listing. And so that's potential for consideration there. on the transfer of the listing. And then there's other items here, agency relationships, just talks about the agency and escrow, et cetera, access, MLS access. The new broker has to get access to the MLS. Don't worry about trust funds because we don't have agents putting money in their trust funds for deposits or whatever. And then on paragraph 7, you'll see it says the listing was obtained through blank agent. Agent is no longer affiliated with broker or will no longer be affiliated with broker, or agent has, as applicable, will or will not be affiliated with new broker, or B, agent remains affiliated with broker. So it could be that it's just a transfer where there has been no transfer of agents from one office to another, or it could be used when an agent is transferring from one office to another and the old broker is willing to release the listing and transfer the listing to the new brokerage. And then it talks about transferring the files from one to the other, and then paragraph 9 has a release where the principal is releasing the old broker since they're now transferring the listing to a new brokerage. So this is the form you would now be able to use, and you'll see there's a place for the signature of the manager for the old office and the manager for the new office to accept the transfer of the listing from one broker to another, and then also a signature of the agent at the very bottom, along with the signature of the principal. So that's the form you can use now if you're transferring a listing from one brokerage to another. Any questions on this form?
It's a form none of you will ever need.
Garrett will do that all the time.
That's a great form. I'm excited about that. That makes things easier.
So, moving along, there's only one other form that was new for June, and that it's kind of new, but it's kind of a revision. It's the fire hardening and defensible space advisory and disclosure. This form looks to be incredibly complicated. When I first read it, it was like, it gave me a headache. But it's not quite as complicated as it looks. So let me explain the elements of this form. First of all, there's two different elements. There's the fire hardening element, which went into effect January 1st of this year. And then there's the defensible space advisory and disclosure, which went into effect July 1st, which is today actually. So it goes into effect today. So both are now in place. So the fire hardening is an ordinance, a state law now, which requires the seller to make certain disclosures to a buyer if the property is located in a high or very high fire severity zone, and if the property was built before 2010, and if the seller is not an exempt seller. So if the seller is like exempt from a TDS, they're also exempt from this form. Same exemptions apply to this as a TDS, successor trustees, REOs, probates, etc. So again, if it's in a high or very high fire severity zone, a non-exempt seller with a property built before 2010, the seller is required to give this form to the buyer and fill out section 3B. 3B has a series of 6 questions that the seller has to answer based on their knowledge. They don't have to go out and investigate anything. They just have to state to the best of their knowledge. And you can look at the questions here: roof coverings made of wood shingles, combustible landscaping, etc., etc. So if the property is not in a high or very high fire severity zone, you do not have to use this form. Some brokerages are using the form no matter what, just to play it safe as an advisory, not so much as a disclosure, because you don't have to make a disclosure if the property is not in a high or very high fire severity zone. But some of the brokerages are just using it anyway, just as an advisory. Now the question is, how do you know whether a property is in a high or very high fire severity zone? Well, the answer to that is you need to get the natural hazard disclosure report and the natural hazard disclosure statement. So you need to get that up front. You can't wait until escrow is about to close to order the NHD report, which agents used to do in the past, for 2 reasons. Number one, there's a 5-day rescission period when the buyer receives the natural hazard report, just like there is with the transfer disclosure statement. So that's the first reason you need it up front. And now the second reason, if you need a second reason, is you've got to determine whether the property is in a high or very high fire severity zone to figure out when you need to use this form. So paragraph 1 explains fire hardening and defensible space. Paragraph 2 is the paragraph that you would have to fill out if your property is located in a high or very high fire severity zone. And then paragraph 4 is the second element of this, which is defensible space. So there's a new state law that says that if that the seller has to issue if they have a report that's been issued within the last 6 months with regard to defensible space, they need to provide that to the buyer. Under the new state ordinance, or the new state law, there's two possibilities. The first possibility is that the seller already has a report either from CAL FIRE or from the fire department, which talks about the defensible space and hopefully has a compliance for that. And if the seller has gotten a report within the last 6 months, they are required by state law to provide that to the buyer before the close of escrow. But more likely than not, the seller won't have such a report, and if they don't have a report, then the law says that the burden shifts to the buyer, and the buyer within 1 year of the close of escrow has to get a report showing that they're in compliance with defensible space. So what's defensible space? Well, it's explained basically in the form, but basically defensible space is an area surrounding the property for 100 feet where there may be issues that could cause the property to catch fire, such as weeds and debris and things like that. So CAL FIRE and or the fire department are the authorities that should be able to go out and check the property and see if it's in compliance or not. So under the state law, two possibilities. One, seller has a report in the last 6 months, they have to give it to the buyer during escrow. Two, seller doesn't have a report, buyer has 1 year to get the report and show they're in compliance. But there's another element to defensible space, and the other element is if there's a local ordinance with regard to defensible space. Some area, and I don't know about Antelope Valley, but some areas have local ordinances that already require inspections for defensible space. And if there's a local ordinance, you have to comply with the local ordinance if it's more strict than the state ordinance. So if you have a local ordinance which says the same thing as the state, then you're in the same position that the seller, if they have a report within the last 6 months, they've got to provide it to the buyer. Or if there is no report, the buyer has 1 year from the close to get into compliance and get a report. You're looking at page 1 of the disclosure and advisory. There is a page 2, but unfortunately I forgot to put it in here. Page 2 is item 4C and D. So item 4, A, B, C, and D at the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2 covers the 4 scenarios: state law, no local, and the seller has a report, or any state law, no local, seller doesn't have a report, local law with a report, local law, seller doesn't have a report. So it covers the 4 instances. So you have to start using this form. The requirements for the defensible space are almost the same as the fire hardening as to who's required. Again, it's if you're in a high or very high fire severity zone. Number 2, exempt sellers are exempt. But the one difference between the fire hardening and defensible space is under the defensible space law, there's no exemption if the property is built before or after 2010. It applies to any property regardless of the year it's built. So the fire hardening part only applies to properties built before 2010. The defensible space part applies to all properties.
Hey Jeff, we had a question. What happens if the buyer doesn't do it after a year? It's just on them, or?
Yeah. If the seller doesn't, if you're under the state law, not the local law, and the buyer is required to do it within a year, then it's on the buyer. You don't have to deal with it anymore. It's up to the buyer to comply with it within the 1 year of close of escrow. Now, if the local ordinance says something different, then you have to comply with whatever the local law says. Now, if you look at the right side of the screen, and I don't know if does the picture interfere with, let me see if I can.
We see the quick guide. It's there.
Okay, so the home, CAR has a bunch of really good quick guides, and I don't know that agents take real advantage of these quick guides because they're really helpful. So if you go to CAR.org, not now, but after the meeting, if you go to CAR.org, on the top right, you'll see a search feature. And the search feature, if you just type in quick guides under the first search feature, it'll pop up all the quick guides. And you see here, there's already a quick guide on home hardening. And if you go down a little bit, there's also a quick guide in defensible space. So this gives you a one-page description, which is great. If you need more information, CAR also has Q&A. So on the defensible space, which is kind of complicated, there's like a 4 or 5 page Q&A already at CAR.org on defensible space. I suggest that you read that when you have a chance. Just go to CAR.org, you go to risk management, you'll see all the Q&As. There's one entitled defensible space. It goes through I don't know, 40 questions that you may have with regard to defensible space and all the different ways that you need to comply with it and all the different questions that arise with regard to the new laws under home hardening and defensible space. So with that, are there any questions right now on the home hardening and the fire hardening and defensible space form?
The only thing that, just for KWAV, the 427, the FHDS, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Advisory, it is just required in our area on files going forward. When you're doing the files, it's just going to be required on all files. So Ken threw that in there, talking with Scott, as in most of the area is in high fire and out in high desert anyways. So that will be
So
required for us.
if the brokerage is requiring the form, that's fine, that's perfectly fine. The seller would only need to fill out section 3B if the property is in a very high fire severity zone. Otherwise, the seller could leave that blank and don't have to fill it out, because you're just giving it as an advisory. So if the property is not in a very high fire zone, the seller would not have to fill out 3B. If it is, they would have to fill out 3B.
And that will be found on the NHD, on the area NHD. Once you get that from Esquilo, you can see that if it is considered in the high fire.
So exactly.
Which I think Leona Valley, Acton, and area typically is. But anyways.
Do you know if there's a local ordinance in play for either fire hardening or defensible space out in Antelope Valley?
I'm not aware of anything different from, but I'm sure Scott would let me know if there was. So I don't think so.
Yeah, generally, my feeling is that, this is kind of brand new for people that don't have a local ordinance, so it's kind of new for me. But if you were in an area that already had this, you'd probably already be aware of it, because sellers would have been complying with this over time with the local ordinance. So if you're not aware of it, there's a pretty good chance that there wasn't a separate local ordinance in play. So the next form I'm going to go to is this anticipated broker compensation disclosure. This form did not come out in June, but I want to explain a little bit about this. The Department of Justice and the National Association of Realtors, you may have heard about this, they entered into a settlement agreement a couple of months ago where basically the buyer's broker or the buyer's agent is going to have to disclose to the buyer the commission that the buyer's agent is getting paid on the transaction. So in the past, you didn't really have to do that. But under the settlement with the DOJ, Department of Justice, brokers are going to have to disclose to their own principals on the buying side what the commission is payable to the buyer. So CAR put out this form, this anticipated broker compensation disclosure. They drafted it, but they didn't put it out because they were waiting for final word from the DOJ as to exactly how this was going to work. So this form is not out yet. If you look at this form, it actually allows the agent to fill out every property they're showing to a buyer and what the commission is on that property. But we don't really know if that's what the requirement is. The DOJ requirement may just be that the buyer's agent has to disclose to the buyer the commission on the particular property that they happen to be buying or that they happen to be writing an offer on, not on every property they're shown. So this is in limbo. You won't find this form in zip forms, and CAR also did revisions to all the broker representation agreements to also provide information on the commission to the buyer's agent, but everything's on hold because the DOJ, once they came to the settlement with the NAR, they've just been dragging their feet, and I guess they have better things to do, and they haven't really given us any guidance on what we're going to need to do. But the bottom line is that you are going to have to provide the information to the buyer as to what the commission is. Now I don't know what your association or your MLS has done, but some of the MLSs, I'm down in the San Fernando Valley, and CRMLS, they're the largest MLS in the state. They now put the buyer's commission in the public section as opposed to just the agent section. So a buyer could see that if they were given a copy of the public MLS, they could see the commission that's payable to the buyer's agent. I don't know what.
And Jeff, I could speak on that real quick because
Does anybody there know whether?
yeah, I could speak on that real quick because I'm on the MLS committee. We are waiting for the Department of Justice to issue if that's mandatory or not, if we have to put that public or not. So we haven't made a decision yet. Can you, everyone's grumbling, thinking that something like CAR just is doing for fun. Can you do the basis of why, basically why the DOJ, the Department of Justice, like, can you go into that a little bit? Because some people have asked some questions like, why the heck are we doing this?
Well, we're doing it because it was a settlement between the Department of Justice and National Association of Realtors. So the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against NAR, claiming that it was basically not in the best interest of the public to not disclose to the buyer what commission is being paid to the buyer's agent. Sometimes the buyers felt that, and the buyer's agent sometimes felt that the buyer was getting services for free because the commission was being paid by the seller, not the buyer. Part of the settlement was that you can no longer tell a buyer that they're getting any service for free, assuming that the buyer's agent's getting paid commission by the seller. That's not really free. It just works into the whole transaction. So it just so happens that the way our system works, it works through this. Generally, it works through the seller paying the listing broker. The listing broker for the MLS provides a commission to the buyer's agent, and away it goes. But it's
Government control.
the process, so it's not really a free service for the buyer because it's being paid based on the fact that that part of the proceeds are from the seller are going to pay the commission.
Exactly.
So that's the basic. I mean, the reason we have to do it is that the DOJ sued the NAR claiming that it was an antitrust violation. And there's all kinds of lawsuits going on now regarding antitrust, et cetera. And this is a settlement that was entered into to avoid any further problems. And so the bottom line is two things. Number one, well, a couple of things. Number one, you're going to have to disclose the commission to the buyer that the buyer's agent's getting. Number two, you can't say it's any free service to the buyer. And third, you won't be able to search anymore if you were searching the past by commission. In other words, you can't go in there and say, only show me properties that have a commission of 2.5% or more. You won't be able to search by that because the MLSs are required to remove that as a search feature. There's also a lockbox key safe element to this settlement, but not for you to worry about just yet. They're still working through that. The settlement says that any real estate agent, whether they're a member of your association or MLS or not, has to be given access to your key safes. Not so much that they have the right to buy a key safe, but they have to have access to the property through a key safe. So they're working through that as well. Nothing for you to worry about just now, but something that may come up.
It's just, if an LA agent wants to come out and view a home, you can't tell them no. They still need to be a licensed realtor.
They have to be a realtor.
They don't need to be
Not
a
a licensed realtor, a licensed real estate agent.
A licensed real estate
So you
agent,
didn't
not a
have to belong to an
realtor.
association to
You
have
don't.
access to the box.
Yes.
Yeah, they won't have to belong to your MLS or even your association if they're a licensed real estate agent.
Doesn't that mitigate the three-way?
Access to the property.
So sorry, Jeff. I'm just curious. Doesn't that directly, what's my word, contradict the three-way relationship between CAR, NAR, and the local association that we fought so hard to maintain?
Well, I don't know that it contradicts that. Basically, it's just a settlement agreement between NAR and the Department of Justice saying that any agent needs access to the
Bigger
property.
guys
That's
though,
all.
If that's the
But
breakdown
it's
of the
something
local
that hasn't
association.
been hacked out yet, so it's still, it's nothing for you to worry about just yet.
But it also
at
might
some
be a
point,
thing where-
we'll get more clarification on exactly what's required there. And the bottom line is, I assume you want to sell your property, so you want to show it to as many people as you need to show it to. It doesn't go to the issue of paying commissions, by the way. If the offer of compensation to MLS is made to an MLS participant or a member of your association, not to any real estate licensee. So while you have to give them access to the property, you do not have to agree to pay them, because if they're not a member of your MLS or the association, then you haven't made an offer of compensation to them.
Right, it breaks down the fabric of organized real estate as we've worked so hard to maintain.
Well, a little bit, I think
A little
it's a little slow, maybe it's the first step, but yeah,
I don't
there's not a whole lot we can
think
do
it's
about
gonna
it.
be that bad. I think it's going to be-
Waters, but we will get more information on that as time goes on to figure out exactly what needs to be done on this. So moving along, the next forms are not new, they're revisions, and I'm only going to go through the main revisions and what's in there that's of consequence. So the next one is the residential listing agreement. And the main change in the residential listing agreement is down here on page 3, under number 10. You see broker and seller's duties. So you're all aware now of the whole issue with buyer love letters and whether a seller should look at those or not look at those. It's quite the fuss now. The new fair housing form, which auto-populates with the listing and with the purchase. Paragraph 8 of that form talks about the buyer love letters and that there may be information in those letters that if the seller were to use that information to make a decision on who to sell to, it may be discriminatory, it may violate fair housing. So for instance, if the buyer says in a letter that we have a lovely family with 3 children, boom, right away you potentially have a fair housing violation if the seller were to use that to accept that offer over an offer from, say, a single person or whatever. That's one of the categories that's protected familial status. So there's nothing illegal about a buyer presenting a letter. The question is whether the seller is going to look at it or not. So CAR put in paragraph 10C to address the issue of buyer love letters right at the point in time when you're taking listings, so you don't have to deal with this when the offers start coming in. So at the point in time you're taking the listing, number 1, the seller is going to see the fair housing advisory form with paragraph 8, which you should point out to them, which talks about the letters. And then this paragraph 10C states that under item 2A or B, the default is the seller instructs the broker not to present buyer letters. Then paragraph C2B says, if it's checked, that the seller instructs the broker to present the letters, and then if they check that box, there's an advisory that says, the broker advises seller that buyer letters may contain information about protected classes or characteristics, and such information should not be used in the seller's decision of whether to accept, reject, or counter a buyer's offer, and if seller relies on buyer's letters, seller's acting against the advice and should seek the advice of counsel before doing so. So the idea behind putting this in the listing is so that you, as a listing agent, can deal with it right up front. You don't have to worry about it when the offer comes in. If the seller says to you, I don't want to see them, then in the MLS, under the agent remarks, you can put a statement in there saying, seller will not review or look at any letters from the buyer which are included with the offer. If the seller wants the letters, that's fine, that's up to them. But as you can tell under paragraph C2B, there's a statement there that if they're doing so, they have to be careful what's in there and how they make their decisions, and they've been advised by the broker and the agent what the risks are.
Jeff, real
That's
quick.
the main change to the form. There are any questions specifically on that?
Yeah, I want to ask real quick, are there any recommendations or any guidance on anything car related that would say what could be put on a letter like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can, for instance, it's, you know, I was a broker, and still am a broker, but I actually was managed a real estate office for many years, and we used to submit buyer letters all the time, never thought twice about it. I mean, all of you did if you've been in the business for, you know, any length of time, but all of a sudden this has become a hot issue. So you can put in a letter certainly that we love your house, you know, that kind of stuff, but as soon as you start describing the physical characteristics of the buyer and any area that would be a protected class, you run into problems. So if you have familial status, race, you know, whether you have kids or not kids, things like that, that's all stuff that you can do it. There's nothing illegal about presenting such a letter. It's just that the seller needs to be careful that they don't use that in their decision in deciding what offer to take. And one of the ways to make sure you don't do it is just say, I'm not going to look at it.
Gotcha.
So the other changes, a couple other changes in the listing agreement. If you go back to paragraph 7C, it talks about something coming soon. Coming soon is kind of a mess right now. All the different associations and MLSs are handling it slightly differently. You know, it's part of the clear cooperation policy that came out from NAR about a year ago or so. There's just a statement in here that says that the seller should discuss with the agent how days on market is calculated based on coming soon, because Each MLS handles it slightly differently. I don't know how yours does, but in our area, Southland Regional, if it's coming soon, days on market they don't count days on market in the coming soon category until it's put into active, but you may do it differently up there. And then the other change here is in paragraph E, 10E. You'll see that there's it says seller agrees within blank days of the beginning date of this agreement to order and when required by the provider pay for. And then you see the first one is the natural hazard disclosure report. So we put it right in there because we want to get that report, like I said earlier, you want to get it right up front for the two reasons I mentioned earlier. It's a statutory requirement that doesn't apply to the rescission period, and you've got to find out whether the property's in a high or very high fire severity zone. There's also some other things in there that the seller might authorize getting and paying for up front, pest control possibly, property inspection, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been added into the form as well. Don't worry about red and blue. I'm just showing you a working copy of the form. Obviously, the final version is all in black, but this kind of tells you what the changes were, so it's easier to see by using this as your guide. That's pretty much the change there. The next form is the lease listing agreement, and the main change, there's one change on page 1, which kind of clarifies what the cooperating broker is going to get paid. It was a little confusing in the previous lease listing form. So this clarifies it, makes it clear what the cooperating broker is going to get paid. But the main change in this form is down, I'm going to go past here, it's down here under paragraph 14F, termination of agency relationships. For any of you that have ever done leases, once you do the lease, it seems like the landlord and the tenant seems like you're permanently their agent. So if there's a problem 6 months up the road because the tenant doesn't pay his rent or the buyer or the landlord doesn't fix something, they come to you and go, you need to take care of this. You did the lease.
Yep.
That's not really the way it's supposed to work. So I'm going to read paragraph F because it explains agency. It says termination of agency relationship. Owner acknowledges and agrees that unless the owner and broker enter into a separate property management agreement, the broker will not represent owner in any manner regarding the management of the premises. Owner further agrees that the representation duties of an agency relationship with the broker terminate at the earlier of, and then you have checkboxes. One is entering into a rental or lease agreement for the premises, and if checked, the tenant's occupancy of the property, delivering keys to the tenant's walkthrough, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it pretty clear, regardless of what box you check, that once the lease is signed and the tenant's in the property and they've got the keys, that your job, unless you're a property management company or you're a property manager, your job's done. And if they've got a problem 3 months up the road, if they don't come to you for you to fix it, they need to go to a real estate attorney or just deal directly with the tenant with regard to this issue. So this was an important addition that you can point to now when you get that call that, like, okay, the tenant hasn't paid, fix it. Or the landlord hasn't fixed the property, it's your problem agent, you represent the landlord, so get it done. You know. The other change in the form up here under paragraph M is just a statement when you take listing whether the property is separately gas metered, electric metered, whether there's been a death on the premises within the last 3 years, because that's something that needs to be disclosed to a tenant, and any other material facts that you're going to need to disclose to the tenant once you get a tenant for the property. So that's the changes in the lease form. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay, I'm gonna move along to the cooperating broker compensation agreement. You can see it's all in red, but don't worry about that. They just reorganized the form, so it's not like there's a change especially, it's just reorganized to make it clear, hopefully. But the one change, and I don't know why this wasn't in the form previously, but the one change is, on page 2, if you as the buyer's agent are gonna accept a commission less than what's in the MLS, voluntarily accepted, so, you make an offer, you haven't made an offer yet, and you talk to the listing agent, and the listing agent says to you, well, we can put a deal together, but, if we do, we're gonna have to agree to cut our commission. Are you willing to do that? You voluntarily agree to do that. And so this is a form that now requires management or the broker of the buyer's office to sign this form if the buyer's agent is agreeing to reduce the commission from what's in the MLS. Because after all, commissions are paid broker to broker, and the broker or the manager should be the one signing off on this, agreeing along with the agent to take a lower commission. So there's now a place for both the listing agent or the seller's agent to sign if paragraphs 3B, 3C, 4, or 6 is checked, and there's a place for the buyer's agent and manager to sign, the buyer's manager to sign, if paragraph 3B is checked and the commission is being reduced. So that's the only main change to that form. The next form is a referral fee agreement. This form's been around forever. The change that we made here is, it said in the past that if you're giving a referral from one broker to another, it would say that if the buyer or the seller buys the property or sells the property within 12 months. But it didn't really define what it meant by selling it. It didn't say, well, does that mean the escrow has to close by that time, or you just have to get into a purchase agreement by that time? So it's been changed to clarify it that it's just entering into the contract during the referral fee period. So in other words, just like a listing agreement, if you have a listing agreement and the buyer enters into a contract with the seller during the listing agreement, but it closes after the listing expires, you're still entitled to a commission because that's what the language says in the listing agreement. It says that as long as the buyer and seller enter into a contract during the listing agreement, it doesn't make any difference when it closes, you're entitled to your fee. Well, now the referral fee agreement says the same thing. As long as the parties enter into the agreement within the time frame provided in the referral fee agreement, regardless of when it closes, the party would be entitled to the referral. So that's the main change in the referral fee. Property images agreement. The only change here is under 7. There's now a paragraph about drone use and indemnification. Drones are becoming more popular in taking aerial pictures of the property, so there's a paragraph in here that deals with that issue and with indemnification with regard to drone usage. That was a change there. And then the statewide buyer and seller advisory is being, it's such a long form. I don't know, I forget what the new version is. It might be 16 or 17 or 18 pages. But if you look at page 2 of the form, it used to have the table of contents at the top, which just had those 7 categories. They would be broken into category 1 would be the investigation of the physical condition, category 2 would be the property use and ownership, so forth and so on. But it's such a long form and there's so many paragraphs that what the committee did was they did a table of contents which actually breaks things down alphabetically so that you can find them. So for instance, if you're looking for a paragraph that talks about square footage, you can go alphabetically down to number 58, which says square footage, and it directs you to the proper page number. If you're looking for, whatever you're looking for, check it out. Depth of the property is number 7, and it's on page 10. So it gives you a quick reference where to find things because it's just such a long form. So those are basically the changes from June as to the various forms. As I mentioned, there's quick guides and all kinds of stuff. So we talked about the quick guide on home hardening and defensible space, but there's also a quick guide on buyers' interest letters, buyers' love letters. So that's something you can refer to as well. By the way, the quick guides can be given out to your clients. So if you have a client who wants information, there's nothing that prevents you from giving out either the Q&As or the quick guides from CAR. They're not confidential. The forms, obviously, are something that you can't just hand out blank forms to clients, but these quick guides can be given out to clients. So with that, I am going to go to some additional topics now. First one I'm going to cover is the residential purchase agreement that's coming out in December. So as I mentioned, I'm on the committee that revised the form. We just finished it last week, actually. We've been working on it for about a year and a half, or maybe even longer. Had all kinds of meetings, all kinds of comments, not even hundreds of comments, like thousands of comments from members. The form, I'll preface it by saying that the new form doesn't change in any way the way you do business. So for instance, the removal of contingencies is all the same, the notice to buyer form is the same, the contingencies are the same, everything's pretty much the same. It's not like remember back, if some of you have been around long enough, will remember when it was changed from a passive method of removal of contingencies to an active method. That was a major change in doing business. Some of you were around when the pest control was taken out of the contract and taken out of the separate addendum. That was a major change, but there's nothing in the new purchase agreement that really changes substantially the way you're going to do business and the way the buyer and seller are going to do business. But with that said, it is a major revision. It looks completely different than the current residential purchase agreement. And the main change is that all of the items that require fill-in, like all the different contingencies for appraisal, inspections, investigations, loans, they're all contained in a matrix on the first 3 pages of the form. So this way, you'll be able to look at the first 3 pages of the form, and you'll be able to get all the essentials and all the fill in the blanks and all the time frames, etc. The rest of the form, goes to issues that are covered in the first 3 pages. So there's more of a description of how the appraisal contingency works, how the inspection contingency works, etc., etc., etc. But you'll be able to look at the first 3 pages, and at a glance, you'll be able to see all the terms that are going to be critical to the buyer and to the seller. So it's interesting. I mean, they're like anything, any change. Some people love it, some people hate it. It seems that the majority of people really liked it, but there was certainly a group that did not like it. They felt that they liked the old form better. They never really liked the old form until the new form came out, and they decided they liked the old one. But the old one was fine, except that it was over the years, we had added a lot of clauses to it, and it didn't really flow necessarily all that well. And for instance, I just had a deal recently where somebody snuck something in on one of the defaults under the notice to buyer perform. They snuck in a change from 2 days to 7 days, and nobody caught it because it was later on in the contract. Now all the fill-in stuff's going to be on the first 3 pages, so it'll be a lot more difficult to miss and a lot more difficult to try to squeeze things in there, like sneak stuff in there as a buyer's agent. So hopefully it'll work much better. So the form will be out in December, 2nd or 3rd week of December. CAR will begin training in August. If you want to see the form, you can actually go, I believe it's still posted at car.org. If you go to car.org, and if you click on the tab, the standard forms tab, you should see the latest revision of the purchase agreement, so you can take a look at it. I don't know, I haven't looked at it the last few days to see what's posted right now, but you should see the residential purchase agreement so you can get a kind of a glance at it before the training starts. I think that most of you are going to want to take the training because it's set up quite differently than the old form, and it does require some education to make sure you understand exactly how it works. Any questions on that? Okay, I'm going to move along, and I'm going to cover 3 forms that I'm going to mention to you that you may or may not be aware of, but that are really kind of underused. The first 2 forms are the seller non-agency form and the buyer non-agency form. So the seller non-agency form is a form that's in the Zip Forms library, and it's a form that you would use as an example. Let's say you have a for sale by owner, and the for sale by owner says to you, I'm not listing the property with you. If you bring me a buyer, I'll give you a commission, but you're not representing me. You can represent the buyer if you want to, but I'll pay you a commission. So you go ahead and get a single party compensation agreement, which states that the seller agrees to pay you if they sell the property to a particular buyer. But you also need, at that point, if you're not going to represent the seller, you're only going to represent the buyer, you need to provide the seller with a seller non-agency form, which indicates that you do not represent the seller, you only represent the buyer. The reason that's so important is that if you're dealing with a for sale by owner, do you think that they have the disclosure forms to fill out?
No.
No, they're not. Who's going to give them the disclosure forms? You, right? Because you're the only broker involved in the transaction. You're a for sale by owner. So when you give them those forms, if you keep giving them forms, at some point they're going to go, if there's a problem, they're going to go, well, gee, I thought you were representing me because you provided me with all the forms. So you need to use that seller non-agency form, which very clearly states that you do not represent them, that if they want representation, they need to talk to their own broker or their own real estate attorney. In addition to that, if you're dealing with a for sale by owner, the other thing I would suggest is that anytime even when you get the seller non-agency form signed, anytime you send them like a form or anything, I would put a statement at the bottom of your email saying, I'm providing this as courtesy, but please be aware that I do not represent you in this transaction. Well, you just keep pounding them over the head so they can't come back later and say, gee, I thought you represented me. On the buying side, you might have a situation where you have a buyer sometimes you have a buyer who might be an attorney who wants to represent himself, and they can represent themselves. I mean, technically you can't pay them a commission unless they have a broker's license, but they can represent themselves if they want to. And if they do, then you provide them with a buyer non-agency form because you're representing the seller, you're not representing the buyer. Or it may not be an attorney, it may just be any buyer who doesn't want to be represented, doesn't have a broker, and you're not representing them, you're only representing the seller. So again, you're going to provide them with a buyer non-agency form. Any questions on those two forms? No? Okay. The next form I'm going to talk about, it's not exactly a form, but if you look at the right side of your screen, you see an acting against the advice of broker form. And right now, it's a sample letter. Does everybody know how to get to the sample letters in the zip forms library? It's not, if you go to the zip form library, by default, what you see are the forms. But there's that drop-down menu on the left that you can drop down and you'll see an area that's called sample letters. One of the sample letters is acting against advice of broker. And there's one for the buyer and there's one for the seller. And so when would you use this form? So let's say you have a buyer, especially in the market we're in now, we have buyers all the time that say to you, I have to get this property, what do I need to do? I'll waive all my contingencies, I'll waive my inspection, I'll waive my appraisal, I'll waive everything, I just want to get the property. So that's a terrible idea, but I understand the realities of the marketplace, and buyers do what they want to do to get the property, and sometimes they're willing to remove all their contingencies. So if they're doing that, I strongly suggest that you provide them with this acting against the advice of broker form, which says in there, there's check boxes at the end that you can fill out. I don't have the form in front of me, but this is just the quick guide. But there's check boxes where you can check making a non-contingent offer, and there's also an area to write in things. So it may be making a non-contingent offer, it may be making an offer that's not contingent on just the inspections or the appraisal. It may be an offer where they're buying it sight unseen. You know, they're in New York and they buy a property without ever seeing it. They can do that. There's nothing that's illegal about it, but I think to protect yourself, you want to have something in writing that says, you know, you're making this offer without seeing the property. If you do so, you're just acting against our advice. So you have something on the record that shows that you had a discussion with them or that you provided them with something indicating that, hey, this isn't a really good idea. So there's an acting against the advice form or letter for the buyer, and there's one for the seller. I believe that CAR is going to turn it into a form in the not too distant future, so it'll actually be a form that the buyer and seller would sign. But right now, it's just a letter that you would send that you'll have proof you sent it, but there's no place necessarily for the buyer or seller to sign off on it, but you still have the proof that you sent it to them. So in this, oh, you know what? Just real quickly, going back to, I forgot, under the statewide buyer and seller advisory that I covered before, there were a few changes that I probably should mention. There's a section on fire hardening and wildfire disasters in the statewide buyer and seller, although you have a separate form now, but it kind of explains it. There's also a section on wildlife, because there's so much wildlife in California. And also for areas that are on the coast, there's a sea level rise coastal property. So those are the main changes in that form. So that's back to the right side, that's the form for acting against the advice of broker, and the seller non-agency, the buyer non-agency. And are there any questions on that?
No, sir. No.
Okay, the next thing I want to cover is some of the problem areas that agents have and that buyers and sellers have. And the first one I want to cover is the appraisal contingency and some of the language that we've seen that's put into contracts where buyers will, you know, again, the market is so competitive that buyers will write all kinds of things into the offer. They'll either remove their appraisal contingency altogether, or they will put some language in the offer that says that they'll pay, let's say, $20,000 above the appraised value if the appraisal comes in low, you know, but not to exceed the purchase price. So we've had a number of these, and this is a really good quick guide. So afterwards, take a look at this quick guide. It talks about the right and wrong way of amending the appraisal contingency. So here's potentially the wrong way of doing it. If you put in there that the buyer will pay $20,000 above the appraisal if the appraisal comes in low, then the appraisal comes in low, the buyer says, okay, I'll pay the, you know, appraisal comes in at $550, the property sold for $590 or whatever, and the buyer said they'll pay $20,000 above, so they said, okay, came in at $550, I'll pay $570, we got a deal. But the purchase price was $590. So where did it say in that language that the buyer drew up that the seller agrees to lower the purchase price by that amount. All it said was that the buyer is willing to pay $20,000 more. It never said that the seller was willing to accept that. So if you want to have a situation where you bind the seller to a low appraisal, you're gonna have language in there that says that. And there is language in here at the very bottom about lowering or raising the purchase price that you could use if you want to try to bind a seller to a low appraisal. Now, most sellers won't sign that. If I was a seller, I wouldn't sign it. But again, you've got to use the proper language, and you see there's a bunch of wrongs here. So take a look at this afterwards. The other thing that you see sometimes is the buyer will say that they will make up the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price, period, without any ceiling on it. You can do that. The problem with that is, in the market we're in now, and with prices getting bid up, I mean, your buyer might anticipate, well, it's $10,000 low the appraisal, is fine. What if it comes in $100,000? I mean, those things are happening now. Now all of a sudden the buyer said they're going to pay the difference between the appraised value and the purchase price, and it comes in at a number way lower than they expected. I mean, obviously there's a lot of ways for a buyer to get out of a contract, but if they're writing a non-contingent offer and they've already gotten their statutory disclosures and they make an offer like that, it could be problematical for a buyer. So anyway, take a look at this quick guide. I think it's good to show you what language will work and what language is problematical. Any questions on that before I move along to the next topic?
No.
Hear anything?
We're good.
Okay, good. So the next one I'm going to talk about, which is equally complicated or maybe even more complicated, is escalation clauses. I'm sure that you've all dealt with those now. If you've been representing buyers or sellers, a buyer will come in and they'll write in their offer that they'll pay $5,000 more than any other offer that's been received by the seller, or $10,000, or whatever the numbers. So this is a quick guide for escalation clauses, explaining what an escalation clause is and what the advantages and pros and cons are. So to have an escalation clause that protects the buyer, it would be best to say that the buyer will pay $5,000, whatever the number is, $5,000 above any other offer, not to exceed $700,000, whatever the cap is. But the problem with that is if you put in an offer that you will pay $5,000 above any other offer, not to exceed $700,000, it's like playing poker when everybody else, you're playing 7-card stud and you've got 3 cards down, everybody else has 3 cards down, and all your cards are up. Because you've now told the seller that you'll pay $700,000. Right. So the seller doesn't have to pay any attention to the fact that you said that they'll match an offer of $5,000 higher than any other offer. They can just say, oh, this buyer's willing to go to $700,000, I'm just going to counter with $700,000. And if they counter with $700,000, then the buyer has to decide whether they want to pay that or not. So you're giving away your hand by putting a cap on it. But if you don't put a cap on it, in the current market, think of what you're doing. So you're saying you'll pay $5,000 above, property's listed at $550. So you make an offer and you say you'll pay $5,000 above the highest offer, and the property gets bid up to $650. Now you're saying you'll pay $655, and that's something the buyer may never have anticipated going that high. Again, the buyer's got potential outs, but you have to exercise your cancellation rights in good faith, and you can get into problems there. So what happens if you have 2 or 3 or 4 escalation clauses? So you get 4 buyers who write escalation clauses, all saying they'll pay $5,000 higher than the other offer. Well, that's impossible. Keep in mind that the seller doesn't have to pay any attention to an escalation clause. The seller can simply look at that and go, you know what? I don't really care who's willing to do an escalation clause. I'm just going to go back to all these buyers, do a multiple counteroffer, or tell them to give their best and final, let them give their best offer, and then I'll pick the one I like. So the seller's under no obligation to comply with an escalation clause. If the seller does decide to go with an escalation clause, the seller would be required to give this buyer a copy of the offer that the buyer is saying that they will go higher than, although you would white out the names of the buyer just for privacy reasons. But you give them a copy of the offer, and then the buyer would be required theoretically to go $5,000 or $10,000, whatever they agreed to do, above the offer. So again, take a look at this escalation clause quick guide. I think it has really good information in it. I think it's helpful for you. Questions on this?
Jeff, I do have a question on that. With the showing the competing offers that,
Yes.
and you're saying whiting out the buyers' names, how about the brokerage and stuff like that? Should that be whited out? Because I've been asked this question several times.
I would probably, I think it's more critical that you white out the buyer's name, because that, the broker's name, I guess I probably would white it out just because I don't think it's critical in providing the offer to the buyer. But I think the buyer's name is more critical than the broker, because after all, the brokers are in the business of writing offers, and it's not really much of a privacy issue that they wrote an offer on a property. But it certainly could be a privacy issue that a particular buyer wrote an offer on the property.
Okay, so once their names are off of there, we have no liability sharing
Right.
that offer?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. The next quick item and the next thing I want to discuss is non-contingent offers, and I already kind of touched upon that. So, in this marketplace, I'm sure you've all run into buyers who want to make a non-contingent offer because they've lost out on 6 properties already or 12 properties, and they get fed up, and what do I need to do to get the property? So they decide to make a non-contingent offer. So what is a non-contingent offer? If you have a non-contingent offer, then it's not contingent on anything, but keep in mind that the statutory disclosures, the TDS, the natural hazard disclosure form, the lead-based paint, the listing agent's avid, those are all statutory requirements that have a 5-day rescission period regardless of whether you make a non-contingent offer or not, and you can't waive those. The buyer can't waive those. So even on a non-contingent offer, the buyer has the ability to rescind the contract within 5 days of receipt of the statutory disclosures. Now, I will tell you that in Northern California, especially in Northern California, they have started to do business differently than most of us in Southern California. In Northern California, what they're doing a lot of the time there is they're providing the buyer with all the statutory disclosures and sometimes with a pre-sale inspection report that the seller does before an offer is written. And so that buyer, if they get that stuff before an offer is written, that statutory rescission period is gone. If you get the TDS, the listing agent's avid, the natural hazard, and the lead before an offer is written, then there is no rescission period. And a lot of times they're doing pre-sale reports that they give to the buyer. So that's a different way of doing business, and I think they're finding it advantageous up there, because I think because they're doing it that way, they got less deals falling out because the buyers have the information before, not after the offer's been accepted. So I think that may be a trend that starts to creep down to Southern California to some extent. But at any rate, if you're doing a non-contingent offer, you still have the right to rescind unless you got all the statutory disclosures before you wrote the offer. But there's just all kinds of potential issues with a non-contingent offer. If you make an offer that's not contingent on an investigation of the property, and then you get your statutory disclosures and the 5 days runs, and then you somehow find out there's a problem with the property, what are you going to do about it? There's no contingency. There may be a problem with the property. You can claim, that the seller didn't disclose it. If it's a non-disclosure issue, the buyer can go after the seller. But as an example, what if there's a foundation crack that the seller is unaware of that would have been discovered by a home inspector, but there's no home inspection done here, it's a non-contingent offer, and the buyer doesn't find out about the foundation crack until after the escrow closes. Well, the buyer's not going to blame themselves, because the buyers never blame themselves, they always blame everybody else. So they blame the broker, they blame the seller, everybody else. So we're actually recommending that if you get, as a listing broker, if you get an offer that's not contingent on an inspection or investigation, we're actually recommending that it's in the best interest of the seller and certainly the listing agent and the buyer's agent to write back in a short time frame for inspections. Like maybe put in 5 or 7 days that the buyer's right to inspect, because it's not really in anybody's best interest to sell a property without an inspection of the property.
Right.
It's just a bad idea. Now, with regard to loans and appraisals, we've already talked about the appraisal situation. If you make an offer without an appraisal, if you remove the appraisal contingency, if the appraisal comes in low, you're still bound to buy the property. And the way the purchase contract works now is you can't use the loan contingency to get out of the deal if the only reason you can't get your loan is because the appraisal comes in low. The loan contingency is not for the appraisal, it's for the buyer qualifying. So if the buyer can't qualify because their credit's bad or they don't make enough money, you can get out of loan contingency. But if you don't have an appraisal contingency and you have your loan contingency, you can't use a low appraisal to get out because the lender won't make the loan. So if you remove the appraisal contingency up front, that's a risk. If you remove the loan contingency up front, that's a risk too. But that one, I guess I'm a little bit less concerned about it, because if the buyer removes the loan contingency up front, they better know that they've got good credit and that they're going to be able to get the loan, and they've talked to a lender beforehand. Obviously things pop up that cause problems, but at least that's something that on the loan that the buyer has some control over, and they have some knowledge of what their financial status is and whether they can qualify for the loan, as opposed to the appraisal, which they have no control over, and the inspection of the property, the investigation of the property, which if they don't do it, they don't have any knowledge of what's going on with the property other than what the seller discloses. So keep in mind, on a non-contingent offer, I would strongly suggest you use the acting against advice of broker buyer form, which is again in the sample letter form in the CAR library. Any questions on non-contingent offers before I move along? Nope. Okay, the next topic I wanted to talk about was, you're seeing now that Zillow has become a seller as well as a broker. And so Zillow sells properties now, and they have their own contract, as do there's Rex, REX, which has their own contracts. They're not members of CAR. And there's a number of third parties now that are sellers that are insisting that the buyers use their own seller contracts, not the CAR contract. And the problem with that is that these contracts generally are slanted towards the seller. And if you're representing the buyer on, let's say, a Zillow property, when you get that offer form, you're going to see that there's language in there that has release language the buyer's agreeing to. They're releasing the seller of liability for this and that. There's shortened time frames where the buyer can bring an action against the seller. There's language about what the seller doesn't have to provide to the buyer, which may be in violation of the law. So the problem is, you can't give legal advice to your clients, but if you get an offer back from Zillow or Rex or one of these other companies that's not a CAR form, you really need to advise the buyer in writing to have that form reviewed by their own real estate attorney before they sign off on it, because there are things in there that certainly affect their rights and remedies if they sign off on it. And that's just the nature of the business now. There's things out there that are problematical that they need to talk to a real estate attorney about to get some advice on it. The real estate attorney says, go ahead, at least you're out of the loop, and you have the insulation of having an attorney advise them on what was okay and what was not okay, as opposed to you doing it. So that's becoming more and more of a problem as Zillow and some of the others become more and more sellers of properties, because they're buying these properties from owners, and then they're turning around and selling them at Zillow. So that's one thing I wanted to cover. The next thing is the do not call rules. There are still do not call rules in effect. You're not supposed to call anybody on their cell phone without their previous permission. And if they're on the do not call federal registry, and you can subscribe to the do not call list, where it'll give you 5 area codes that for free, I believe. So you can do 661 and 213 and 818, whatever, and it'll show you which cell phones are on the do not call list. The list is extraordinarily long. Seems like everybody's on this list. So there's a lot of cell phones that are not supposed to be contacted. We have been hit with a number of small claims lawsuits where parties are claiming anywhere from $2,500 to $10,000 because agents contacted the person on the do not call list, and the law does allow for in between $500 and $1,500 fine or $500 to $1,500 recovery by a person who's contacted per incident. So if you call somebody 5 times on their cell phone, it can start to add up. So you need to be aware that do not call list is still in play, and if you're doing cold calling, which is fine, you need to be aware that you're not supposed to call people on a cell phone if it's a private cell phone. Now, there's an exception for business phone. If the cell phone is their business line, there's actually an exception in law that you can contact somebody on their business line. But if it's a personal cell phone, you're not supposed to be contacting them. Moving along to Prop 19, I'm not going to cover that in any detail, but there is a quick guide on that. I'm sure you're all aware by now that Prop 19 is the proposition that passed this year that basically allows a an owner to move to a new property and take their tax basis with them, even if they're buying up. The old law said they had to be buying down, you could only do it once, it had to be in the same county or a county that approved it, blah, 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 blah. The new law says you can take your tax basis with you even if you're buying up. There's kind of a formula for working on that. You can do it more than once, you can do it numerous times. It applies to people 65 years of age or people who are subject to a disaster relief from the fires or et cetera, earthquakes or whatever, and also disabled people. So it's expanded it greatly so that more people can take their old tax basis with them. So there is also a Q&A on this, but you might start with a quick guide, and this is a good quick guide on Prop 19 that kind of gives you an idea of what that is. And by the way, this can be given out to your clients. Please, please do not give your clients tax advice on this. If they want any advice on Prop 19, they should talk to their CPA, right? So the next thing I wanted to mention was the TDS. The transfer disclosures have been changed the beginning of this year. There used to be, in Section 1, Section 1 is an area that's entitled substitute disclosures. And it used to be that there were two choices, there were two checkboxes. One was for a substitute disclosure report that you had, that the seller had, and the other one was a substitute disclosure for reports obtained in the process of selling the property. It was kind of confusing, but there was no third choice. And what would happen is the seller didn't have a substitute disclosure, so they would leave it blank. And some clever plaintiff attorneys figured out that it was left blank, that you didn't have a fully completed TDS, and according to the law, the 5-day rescission period doesn't start running until the buyer gets a fully completed TDS. So CAR added in the third box, which is no substitute disclosure for this transaction. And that's the box that your seller should check probably 95 or 98% of the time. And the reason that CAR says that, and I say it, is that most reports that you give to a buyer are not going to be substitute disclosures. So for instance, let's say the seller did a pre-sale inspection. You know, they had an inspector come out and inspect the property, and they give that to the buyer. That's really not a substitute disclosure. It's nice that they did an inspection, but it's not a substitute disclosure for what the seller knows about the property. So it really wouldn't be, it's a report you'd have to give to the seller, to the buyer, because you have the report, but it's not a substitute disclosure. So what would be a substitute disclosure? Well, let's say the seller had an asbestos company come out and check a cottage cheese ceiling for asbestos, and they did a report on that. To me, that's a perfect example of a substitute disclosure because you have a report from an asbestos company telling you whether there's asbestos in the ceiling as opposed to the seller, because that's one of the questions the seller has to answer on page 2. So that would be a substitute disclosure. Now, the law now requires that the seller provide the buyer with all the reports they have, all the inspection reports they have, and you're going to do that as part of your transaction, and you're going to do it along with the CAR receipt for reports form, because the receipt for report form has a lot of good language in there, a lot of disclaimer language saying that, hey, we're providing you these reports, but you should get your own reports. The seller and the listing agent are not making any representations as to what's contained in these reports. You don't, as a buyer, you don't have any recourse against the person who did this report if you didn't order it. So there's a lot of good disclaimer language. So you want to use the receipt for reports form when you're giving the reports to the buyer, so you have a document showing what reports were given, and you've got all that nice disclaimer language. But again, back to the TDS, you probably want to have the seller check the box saying no substitute disclosure, then you've completed Section 1. So that's why I mentioned it here. Deposit disputes. One more thing I wanted to cover is deposit disputes. You need to be careful when there's a deposit dispute that you don't give legal advice to the buyers or sellers, because it may be a fairly obvious case to you that, let's say the buyer did their inspection, they still have their contingencies, they say they're canceling based on their inspection, and they say to you, well, aren't I entitled to get my deposit back? And you say, yeah, you're gonna get your deposit back. And then the seller refuses to sign a cancellation instruction, so the deposit gets tied up, and then they start looking at you going, you never told me that this could happen. So really, when you're having a deposit dispute, once again, any legal questions, you've got to refer them to their own real estate attorney to get legal advice on that. Even the most simple deposit dispute could turn ugly and facts come up that you maybe weren't aware of to begin with. So just make sure you get into their own legal counsel to deal with that. One thing that Scott had asked me to talk about specifically was filling out the AVID form, the Agent Visual Inspection Disclosure Form. So you're probably all aware that the AVID form is not a mandatory legal requirement from the state, but I'm quite sure that it's a mandatory requirement for Keller Williams Antelope Valley that you use an AVID as opposed to just using page 3 of the TDS, because theoretically you can use page 3 of the TDS and make your disclosure there, but it's not going to be as thorough as using an AVID. But keep in mind that if another agent from outside uses the TDS to make their disclosure, you can't go back to them and say, you have to use an AVID. There's no such thing as you have to use an AVID. The law just says that an agent has to do a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the property and disclose the results in writing to the buyer. It doesn't say you have to use an AVID form. But you're going to do it because your company requires it, and almost any brokerage of any size is going to require the AVID. So what Scott asked me to cover was how you fill out the AVID. I think he mentioned that there were agents that just put into every sentence that the buyers to obtain their own inspection of the property. That's not the proper way of filling out the AVID. The purpose of the AVID is for you to disclose what you see, what you hear, what you smell at the property. I always say that you're not using your brain when you fill out the form. You're just using your eyes, your ears, and your nose, because you're just going to say what you see, hear, and smell, not what you think the cause is. That's not your job. So you're filling out the AVID, you know that there's all these different rooms, living room, dining room. So you go through the living room, and if you see a crack on the wall, you're not going to say it's a settling crack or a big crack or a small crack, no adjectives, no explanations. You're just going to say crack noted on the wall. If there's a crack in the tile in the kitchen, crack in the tile, peeling wallpaper, whatever. So you go through each room. If you go through a room and you don't see anything, what you're going to say in that blank, don't leave it blank, put in nothing noted. So you're going to say for living room, nothing noted. Family room, nothing noted. Kitchen, crack in tile on countertop, whatever. The other thing you should not be doing is describing the material used in the house. Don't be putting in there hardwood floors in living room, granite tile in kitchen. This is not the time for you to be marketing. This is the time for you to disclosing what you see as potentially a defect in the property. If you put hardwood in there, or you put granite in there, and it turns out it's not hardwood, it's not granite, they're going to blame you for that. So you need to take it seriously, the AVID. You need to, as a listing agent, you need to do it right up front when you give the TDS, because part of the 5-day rescission period is not only that the seller provide a fully completed TDS, but that the listing agent provide a fully completed AVID to the buyer. So both of those things should go together to the buyer so that 5-day rescission period starts running. The buyer's agent also has to do an AVID, but the buyer's agent AVID is not part of the rescission period, because if it was, the buyer's agent who represents the buyer could simply not do it and then come back later and say, well, I never did my AVID, so the buyer has a right to rescind. So we had to exclude the buyer's AVID from being part of the rescission period, but they're still required to do it. So it's the listing agent AVID that is part of the rescission period. And again, nothing noted, nothing noted. Don't put any adjectives in there. Nothing about the house is in excellent condition. The house is wonderful. It's the greatest house I've ever seen. There's nothing that's perfect. Don't do that. I know you're all salespeople, and so you like to sell, but the AVID is not selling anymore. It's disclosing. So that's the basic guidelines behind filling out the AVID.
Jeff?
With that,
Jeff?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeff, we are having some agents that actually write nothing noted everywhere in the house. Can you address that, please?
Well, the only thing I would address on that, nothing noted all over the house, is that it's pretty unlikely that you would go through the whole house and you would not note anything, and it gives the impression that you really didn't do a thorough investigation. And by the way, on the AVID, you're not only required to do the house inside, but the outside. So let's say there's a leaning wall in the backyard, you're required to go into the backyard and into the garage, and if you see a crack in the garage or a leaning wall, you're supposed to disclose that as well. So back to your question about, I think, was that Amy?
Yes.
Yeah, back to your question, Amy, about putting nothing noted on the entire form. I mean, I suppose you have a house that has nothing that you would note, but it seems very unlikely to me. And you know when you catch it when your agent puts nothing noted and you get the other agents add and they note all kinds of stuff. It's like, wait a second, what's going on here? You noted nothing, and the other agent noted a crack here and a peel here and a this there. So, and especially if you see agents that do that all the time, their evidence constantly are coming in with nothing noted, you know they're not taking it seriously, they're not doing their job. And they may get away with it, but at some point, if there's ever a lawsuit, it's gonna be a problem.
Yeah.
Jeff, I have a couple questions also, real quick. So one would be, and Amy's question, like a fully, we say fully remodeled or rehabbed house, a house flipper out there, they've gone, they've painted, they've carpeted, they put the new granite, all the stainless appliances. Nothing noted is gonna be fairly common. I try to find cracks in the stucco and different things like that outside. Is there anything that we could do about that?
No, I mean, you're still only required to do the seller's required to make all kinds of disclosures if they did a remodel. So they're gonna have to disclose all the reports they have for the remodel and, all kinds of stuff that they have. But as far as the agent's concerned, if you never saw the property, if you saw the property before the remodel, you may have some disclosures to make. But if you were just doing your Avid, and you're seeing the house after it's been remodeled, and you don't know anything, then you're not gonna know anything. You may put something in there saying the house has been remodeled by the seller, but then the seller's gonna be required to give various disclosures about the remodel and possibly the people who did the work and what work was done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you.
One more thing I wanted to mention, just to confuse, if you're not already confused about things, just to further confuse you a little bit, is the new eviction moratorium extension. The state and Los Angeles County have extended the moratorium now through September 30th. So under the state moratorium, there are some carve-outs. Theoretically, under the state moratorium, if you didn't have a local moratorium, under the state moratorium, one of the carve-outs is if the seller is selling the property to a buyer and they're in contract with a buyer who's going to own or occupy the property, theoretically you can get that tenant out. But that particular carve-out is not in the Los Angeles County or Los Angeles City eviction moratorium. There's no such carve-out, and you're bound by the more strict. So in LA County, you can't evict for no just cause. There's no just cause you can't evict. So you can evict both under the LA County and the state if a tenant breaches the contract by not paying the rent, and that is not related to COVID. So they just don't pay the rent, although they're capable of doing it, they just don't pay it. They can be evicted. But if they claim that they have a COVID excuse, then you're not gonna be able to evict them, and you can't evict them just because you decided that you want to get them out, a lease is run out or whatever. You're just stuck with no cause evictions not being allowed right now in LA County.
So when you say eviction, that applies to also notice to vacate. So if you give for example, a 60-day notice to vacate because you're planning on selling it or something like that, that's not gonna, and then if they don't move after 60 days.
It just potentially isn't gonna be enforceable. But here's absolutely, positively, do not get in the middle of a landlord-tenant issue on this. You need to get them to a landlord-tenant attorney because this law is so complicated and it's changing all the time. You do not want to be telling a landlord or tenant what they can do. I'm going to give you the name right now of a company that does landlord evictions that has been very responsive to people calling. The company is S as in Sam, S.I.I. SII Real Estate Services. SII Real Estate Services. The guy's name, the contact person is a guy named David Aniel, A-N-I-E-L. I don't think he's an attorney, but he's very knowledgeable. He's the guy that goes out to office meetings and gives presentations on landlord evictions and stuff. But they have a whole group of attorneys there that do their evictions. Their telephone number is 310-275-5580. 310-275-5580. The other company that does a lot of evictions is Dennis Block. You've probably heard of Dennis Block and Associates. They do a lot of evictions as well. But the feedback I get is it's harder to get a hold of them. It's easier to get a hold of SII Real Estate Services and Dan Aniel and get some answers than it is getting in touch with Dennis Block. But those are two resources if a landlord wants to evict a tenant. And both of them are located in LA County, so they're going to be familiar not only with the state law, but with the LA County law. Now, I don't know if I imagine do you have some stuff up in Kern County?
We do.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know if Kern County has their own eviction moratorium going on or not. If they don't, then you're simply under the state eviction moratorium. If they have their own, then you got to go by whatever their ordinance is if it's stricter than the state. So I'm not sure about Kern County. With that, let's see, one more thing I would mention is there was a new law that went into effect at the beginning of this year regarding HOAs. And it says that if an HOA has a restriction on rentals, on whether owners can rent, that is, they have to allow now at least 25% of the owners to rent. So if they have a restriction against any rentals, it's invalid. It's no longer valid in California. They have to allow at least 25% of the units to be rented. So that's a change that went into effect January 1st. Again, you can't really give legal advice on that. I'm just letting you know in case you get some questions on it. You can refer them to an HOA attorney. I have some HOA attorneys you can refer them to if necessary. That law was the one that went into effect at the beginning of the year. So you may have a bylaw or a CC&R or whatever in an HOA that still says that no rentals are allowed, but that's not enforceable. Now that excludes short-term rentals. They can still have a provision that you're not allowed to do a rental of 30 days or less than 30 days. But this is talking about regular, rentals of the property, like, the normal rental, not a Airbnb type situation.
Jeff, do you know how that would affect FHA or VA financing with regard to some complexes being approved for those two loan types?
How the rental restriction would affect FHA?
Yeah, because FHA and VA generally have a restriction of they don't want so many rentals into a particular housing project that's condos or townhomes.
Yeah, that would be, I think that would, I'm not a lender, but I think that would be totally separate from whatever the FHA VA requirements are. If you want to get an FHA or VA loan, you've got to comply with their requirements. So that would be separate from what the HOAs are required to do or what the law says with regard to HOAs.
Okay.
Okay, with that, I think I've come to the end of what I wanted to cover. I'll certainly be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, I do have a question. This is back on your, the rental moratorium, or the eviction moratorium.
Yeah.
Can you touch, without going into a huge detail, what the concern is, or let me just explain the situation. You have a closing charging at you, and the tenant is supposed to be out, and then the tenant is dragging their feet, and then the tenant is not out when the closing is still supposed to be occurring.
Yeah.
What do you do?
It's a real problem. It's a real problem now because under the eviction moratorium, there really isn't a procedure for getting the tenant out if they refuse to move, unless you have no local ordinance. And under the state one, it was a contract that was entered into with a buyer who's an owner occupied. Then the seller is allowed to give a 60-day notice, but it's got to be a 60-day notice. And if your escrow isn't that long, you got a problem. And even if you give the 60-day notice and the tenant refuses to move out, you got a problem because you can't just throw them out. You have to go through the eviction process, and that can take months and months and months. So it's a real problem. I think right now, you know how you have the carrot and the stick, and usually you can either use the carrot or the stick. The problem now is you don't have much of a stick. The landlord doesn't have much, and the seller doesn't have much of a stick. So all you really have is a carrot. So you may have to do something with that tenant financially to encourage them to move out when the time comes. So you may have to offer them free rent or a cash for keys or something to get them out of the property. And the buyer and seller may have to powwow and decide what they want to do to try to get this tenant to cooperate to move out. Because if they don't cooperate and they don't move out, you're going to have a problem evicting them. And even if you can evict them under the law, it could take months. It's not something that's going to happen if you have an escrow closing next week. And we have those questions all the time. We had one last week where the buyer and seller wound up going to their own attorneys, and the attorneys drafted some language, an amendment basically, where the buyer agreed to pay the seller X amount of money to get the tenants out, and then the seller was going to do this and that, and there was a whole process that was going to go on. But if you get into that scenario, you got to have the buyer and seller talk to an attorney, so it's not something you're going to draft. Because if it goes south, they're going to blame you if you draft anything. But it's a real problem. It's not something that has an easy solution, unfortunately.
I'm assuming though, bottom line, if the tenant's there, escrow shouldn't close.
Well, escrow shouldn't close unless the buyer agrees to close the escrow with the tenant. So if you go back to the tenant and you say to the tenant, what do you want to do? It's up to the tenant. The tenant says, okay, I'll close. Then you get you get something, a paper trail indicating they're aware that the tenant's in there and they agree to close. But then it becomes the tenant's problem, the buyer's problem getting the tenant out. And that could be a major headache. So yeah, the offer right now, if the offer said it was going to be vacant at the close of escrow, the buyer, if it's not vacant, the buyer should probably not close, or at least talk to an attorney and get some legal advice on what they should do, but more than likely, they're not going to close. They may extend the escrow with the seller to give them more time to get the tenant out, or the buyer may say, hey, property's supposed to be vacant at the close of escrow, I'm out of here, I'm not going to wait. And it's a real problem now. I mean, it's not without a simple answer, unfortunately.
And if the buyer lets it close with the tenant in there, has the buyer taken on the responsibility of the tenant?
Yep. Unless, yes, they have, unless the buyer and seller enter in, like I said, this deal from last week, the buyer and seller entered into an agreement between the two of them. They said, okay, we'll close, but here's what's gonna happen. And there was a whole agreement as to how they were gonna arrange things, like money was gonna be paid to this party and this party was gonna do that. But again, that's not something that you would be able to draft. You would have to have both the buyer and seller get their attorneys to draft the appropriate language that protects both of them as well as possible, and go from there. So it could be worked out, but it wouldn't be worked out with you coming up with language, because no matter what language you come up with, if this deal goes south, they're going to blame you.
Perfect, thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right, I'll jump in there. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this new stuff with us, because there's so much changing and it's a weird time. So thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're certainly welcome. Hope all of you got some good information on it. Please feel free to look at the quick guides that I mentioned afterwards, and also the Q&As at CR.org. They're really helpful. And also take a look at the sample of the residential purchase agreement that's coming out in December, so you kind of have a little edge when you go to training. You've already seen what it looks like.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Okay, it was good talking to all of you, and have a good rest of the week.
Have a good rest one. All right, so we're pretty much done, guys. We just gonna go through real quick at the end of the meeting. We have a couple people to spin our wheel here. So Jason and Rhonda, they've been waiting patiently. Rhonda, his timing was perfect. Should come back in here and spin this wheel. So Jason, why don't you come up here first and win some prizes for us?
Thanks all. Ready to go?
Oh yeah.
Here we go. I'm the easy spinner.
Look at that, Subway. Eat fresh. Lunch is on Jason. Of course. All right, Rhonda, come up here and give her a spin. I appreciate the leads, guys, by the way.
Okay, come on, everybody say a prayer.
Say a prayer. Let's get $100.
Come on,
Win
Rhonda.
big, win big, let's go.
You guys spun it very weakly. You can spin again. Spin it harder this time.
Come on.
That's what
Yeah.
Think Vegas.
Vegas. Oh, $50 Amazon card. That ain't bad.
Amazon.
I'm okay with that.
$50 to
Good
Amazon.
job, Rhonda.
Yeah, I owe them my life. So, I can come.
More boxes. All right, guys. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Garrett.
No, thank you guys. Thank you for the leads.
Thank you, guys.
No, I was asking, are everybody off there?
Nope. Now they are.
There you are. It just seems like sometimes Ken gets quite